Okay, hi, I'm Amy Kind, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Claremont McKenna College, and I work in philosophy of mind. Some of my research concerns the imagination, and some of my research concerns issues relating to consciousness and qualia.
And I'm Angela Mendelovici. I'm assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario. My research is also in philosophy of mind, and mainly on intentionality and consciousness, and in particular phenomenal intentionality.
Great. We're here today in conjunction with the publication of this book, Current Controversies in Philosophy of Mind, edited by Uriah Kriegel and published by Routledge. And this book contains 5 different debates on topics in philosophy of mind. There's a debate about embodied cognition between Larry Shapiro and Alvin Goldman, a debate on Russellian monism between Daniel Stojar and Dirk Perboom, a debate on mental representation between Uriah Kriegel and Robert Rupert, and a debate on the importance of consciousness between Charles Seward and Jeff Lee. And we're the 5th debate, and our debate concerns representationalism, specifically concerning moods, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
That's right. So our debate is on representationalism about moods and whether representationalism can give an adequate account of moods. And of course, we're on different sides of this debate. I think that representationalism can give an adequate account of moods, whereas Amy thinks it can't.
Okay, so I think maybe it would be helpful if we did a little setup to start. And the background to this whole debate is really the hard problem of consciousness. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, we've made enormous neuroscientific progress in the 20th century. We've been learning a lot about the brain. There's a lot we still don't know. But about many of the things that we don't know, it seems that it's only a matter of time. So if you think about certain questions about information processing, or certain questions maybe even about attention, it looks as if the progress we've made, neuroscientific, computational progress, that we aren't able to answer those questions in their entirety, but in a matter of time, 10 years, maybe it's a long time, but still looks like those questions will be answered. So although those questions aren't easy, they're thought to be relatively easy when compared to what's often referred to as the hard problem of consciousness, which focuses on the phenomenal character of our mental states. So now, just to give you a sense of the phenomenal character of our experience, just think for a second about your inner life. Think about looking at a beautiful sunset or walking into your house after someone's baked chocolate chip cookies. The smell is everywhere. It's a very good smell. Our inner life is filled not only with these sounds and smells and colors, but also with pulsing pains and also deeply felt emotions and deeply felt moods. So if you think about, a moment of delight, all of these things feel a certain way, they're experiential, and trying to explain their phenomenal character is proven to be very difficult. So it seems as if no matter how much we learn about the brain or about a particular neural process, it still seems that we won't really have learned, or at least this is what people have worried, we won't really learn how this process gives rise to this particular conscious experience. So why, when this neural fiber fires, why would it give rise to a throbbing pain rather than some sort of steady itch? Or why would it give rise to any kind of conscious experience at all, any kind of sensation at all? So it looks as if consciousness, or more specifically phenomenal consciousness, escapes our scientific net. It remains outside the domain of scientific inquiry, and so it poses a problem that philosophers are trying to solve.
Right. So representationalism then is a view about phenomenal consciousness, and it aims to account for phenomenal consciousness in terms of another mental phenomenon, intentionality. So I'll say a little bit about what intentionality is, and then I'll return to representationalism. So intentionality is sometimes described as the ofness or aboutness or directedness of mental states. In some sense or other, at least some mental states seem to say something or be about something. So it can be useful to think of, to get a grip on intentionality, to think of some examples. So for example, take the thought that grass is green. That thought seems to say something. It says that grass is green, or if you prefer, it's about a proposition, the proposition that grass is green. Likewise, perceptual states exhibit intentionality. So take your perceptual experience right now. It's representing a bunch of colors and shapes and objects having those colors and shapes. distances that those objects are away from you. Perhaps it even represents higher level properties like the property of being a book or being a laptop. So that's intentionality, and what a mental state represents, what it says, in other words, is its content or its intentional content. So then representationalism is a view of consciousness that aims to account for it in terms of intentionality. There are many versions of representationalism, weaker and stronger versions. We're going to focus on a fairly strong version that aims to tell us what consciousness is. So it aims to identify or reduce consciousness to intentionality. So we're going to take representationalism to be the view that a mental state's phenomenal character is, or at least is constituted by, or reducible to its intentional content, or at least its intentional content that meets certain further conditions. For example, such as being perceptually represented as opposed to being represented in some other way. But we're also not going to focus on that qualification, at least not very much. So just to give an example of what a representationalist might say that when you're having a phenomenal experience of bluishness, so maybe you're looking at the cover of this excellent new book that just came out, and you have this phenomenal experience of bluishness, the representationalist will say, well, that bluishness, phenomenal character, is nothing over and above the representation of blueness, perhaps the perceptual representation of blueness. So the bluishness in your experience is just a represented content. That's what it is. Now, it's an open question as far as representationalism is concerned, whether intentionality itself can be reduced to something else or can be accounted for in other terms. Some prominent versions of representationalism, which are sometimes called tracking representationalism and advocated by people like Fred Dretske, Michael Tai, and Bill Lycan, want to basically naturalize the mind. So they want to reduce consciousness to intentionality, and then they want to reduce intentionality to a physical tracking relation, a matter of your mental states keeping track of external features or objects or states of affairs. But that's just one version of representationalism. It's representationalism combined with a specific view of intentionality. And there are other versions of representationalism as well that either take intentionality to be primitive, for example, Adam Pouts has a view like that, or are just neutral on the question of whether intentionality can be reduced to something else. So again, we're on different sides of the debate about representationalism. I'm sympathetic to at least some ways of putting the view, whereas Amy, I think, would say she's not a representationalist on any construal.
Right. Certainly not on any construal of these strong forms that we're talking about. And so it probably would be useful for me to just mention some of the sorts of counterexamples that come up with respect to representationalism, starting with the perceptual case. So representationalism, I think, seems plausible when we're talking about the kind of, or at least seems somewhat plausible when we're talking about the bluishness of the book. But there are other kinds of perceptual experiences where it seems less plausible, and there are a bunch of standard counterexamples that get raised. So one kind of counterexample that comes up is cases of blurry vision. It looks as if we compare different experiences, it seems as if the phenomenal character of our experience, the phenomenal character of our experience, the blurriness of our experience, maybe isn't fully captured by what it's representing, the words on the page. Likewise, there are some experiences that seem less representational. So you might think of a phosphene experience, so the kind of experience you get when you push on your eyeball, or after images. So there are some kinds of standard counterexamples in the perceptual sphere. Also, pains seem perhaps plausible that they represent a certain kind of bodily damage. It seems like most pains are representing bodily damages in different areas and so on. But then if you think about some other bodily sensations, so you might think about an itch, what is that itchiness representing? What is the itch representing? Is there representational content there? Is the representational content going to be enough to capture that itchiness, that very persistent itchiness that you're feeling? We might worry about that. And then there are other counterexamples as well, or purported counterexamples as well, but that gives a sense of some of the ones that non-representationalists focus on.
Right, so there are lots and lots of potential counterexamples to representationalism and a lot of debate surrounding them. The representationalist thinks that they can be accounted for, the anti-representationalist doesn't. And we're going to focus today for the rest of our discussion on one particular kind of counterexample or potential counterexample, that of moods. We'll also say a little bit about emotions because that's closely related. So these are potential cases of potential experiences that have phenomenal characters that representationalism arguably may not be able to account for. The problem is that it's not entirely clear what moods and also emotions represent, what their contents are, and so it's not clear what contents the representationalist has available to identify with their phenomenal characters. And it's also not clear that even if we can come up with some contents that are plausibly represented by those states, it's not clear that those will be able to adequately capture their sometimes very rich and distinctive phenomenal characters.
Right. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about emotions and moods. It's, as you said, I think we have to talk a little bit about emotions to set up the case of moods. So moods and emotions are both affective states. They have a lot in common. One thing to think about is the fact that our English language words we tend to use the same word to pick out both moods and emotions. So we can talk about just the emotion of happiness, or we can talk about being in a happy mood. We can talk about having a moment of anxiety where we seem to pick out an emotion, or we can talk about a state of anxiety that's a long-lasting mood, or in an anxious mood, elation, joy, depression. All of these words, it seems like we can talk about an emotion or we can talk about a mood. So it's hard to know exactly how to distinguish them. In terms of the literature, some ways of distinguishing them, one thing that we might do is we might focus on the different functional roles that emotions and moods play. So we might think that emotions have a different functional character than moods do. Another thing that often comes up is to distinguish emotions and moods in terms of their duration. So if you think about emotions, they tend typically to be short-lived. So you have a moment of happiness, that's the emotion, whereas you can be in a happy mood for a day or an hour or 2 weeks. And likewise for other moods, you can certainly have a moment of anxiety, so something causes you anxiousness in the moment, or you can be in an anxious mood that lasts over a period of time. So there are various different ways to try to distinguish it. I think there are some reasons to think that that both of these ways of distinguishing moods and emotions might not work, but for our purposes it's just good to get on the table some of the differences, or the typical differences anyway, between moods and emotions.
Right, and there's more discussion of the different ways of distinguishing between moods and emotions in Amy's chapter. But for our purposes now, I think it makes sense to take emotions to be affective states that seem to be directed at something. So fear of a dog, happiness at some recent event that happened, and on the other hand, to take moods to be affective states that don't seem to be directed at anything. So free-floating anxiety, a sudden burst of happiness, and so on. Now, a caveat, this way of distinguishing between moods and emotions might not carve nature at its joints. It could be that moods and emotions are natural kinds that are defined by other of their features other than their apparent directedness or lack thereof. But for our purposes, this is a useful way for us to use our terminology because, as we'll see, it's the apparent undirectedness of moods that makes them pose a special challenge to representationalism, a challenge that is something over and above the challenge posed by emotions.
That's right. And so maybe just one other thing to note that we're not going to worry about. There's discussion about whether moods should be seen as a subclass of emotions or whether moods and emotions are different states altogether. And we're not going to fuss about that question. So whether it turns out that moods and emotions are different kinds of states, or whether it turns out that moods are a subclass of emotions, maybe the undirected subclass or the apparently undirected subclass, that's not going to really, I think, make a difference for what you and I are going to be talking about, what Angela and I are going to be talking about.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it's also worth noting that we both believe that representationalism has to account for both moods and emotions, no matter how we distinguish between them. So it really doesn't matter how we distinguish between them for our purposes. All right, so the problem now with moods is that, as we said, they seem to be undirected. So you might think they seem not to have any contents at all. And so if they don't have any contents, then they don't have any contents that can account for their phenomenal character, that are there to be identified with their phenomenal character. And if that's all right, then moods are just straightforward counterexamples to representationalism. So not all phenomenal characters are identified with some intentional content, if all that's right. So that's the problem that moods pose for representationalism.
That's right. It's probably, I wish it were as easy as that. It's probably not going to end up being that easy, but that's the apparent problem, and we have to see where it goes. So let's just take some examples. Let's look at some examples just to see how we might get going. So just suppose you're out walking in the woods, and all of a sudden you encounter a wolf, right? There you have a very sharp feeling of fear. Seems like an emotion, right? The wolf has just jumped out at you. It's scary. And there, with that emotion in respect to the wolf, it seems as if your emotion is representing something about that external object, something about the wolf. It's the wolf that's scary. And the wolf is playing a big role in your emotional experience. Also, I should say that when the wolf jumps out at you, probably you're going to, your heart's going to start racing, your pulse is going to start racing, you might start sweating, you might get shaky, there are going to be all these bodily changes as well. So the emotion also seems to have some very apparent, the emotion seems to involve some very apparent changes in your body, and that's also something that it might represent. So if you think about, you can think about other emotional experiences as well. It doesn't have to be fear. If you just think about feeling delight, so something happens, so say a young child comes into the room and does something cute, and you're thinking, oh, that's so cute, and then you have that emotion of happiness or emotion of delight, however we want to describe it. Again, it seems to be directed at the child, what the child is doing. Maybe there's no pulse racing and so on, but there's nonetheless an object in the world that your emotion seems to be connected toward. Now start to look at moods. Well, what about when we just have a mood that is you're just in a fearful mood. It's not that any wolf jumped in your way. It's not that there are any spiders about and so on. You're just feeling scared, and this could last over the course of a morning, over the course of a day. Or even more plausibly, think about a sort of free-floating anxiety or free-floating depression where it doesn't seem to be anchored in anything in the world. Those are the kinds of cases, I think, that seem to pose the challenge for representationalism. It looks as if there isn't something in the world for your mood to grab onto. So just again, to sort of summarize what we're saying, it looks like with emotions, we have a starting point. We can get a foothold in the world. With moods, in many cases, it's hard to see even how to get started with the representationalist picture.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add to that so even though I think that representationalism about emotions is true, I think there are a lot of difficulties here as well. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of contents around to be represented and to potentially account for the phenomenal characters of emotions. But of course the representationalist is going to have to tell us which ones exactly are to be identified with the phenomenal character of emotions, and they're going to have to, whatever they pick out is going to have to adequately somehow match the phenomenal character of emotions. And you might think that there are difficulties there. So you might think that there are difficulties in identifying the phenomenal character of emotions with bodily changes. Maybe they don't seem so maybe the bodily changes don't seem adequate to capture the phenomenal character of emotions. And in the case of a representationalist view of emotions that takes emotions to represent external objects like the wolf, there's a question of how the wolf is being represented. So what properties is your emotion attributing to the wolf that account for the difference between being afraid of the wolf and being happy to see it? So there are different views that can be taken here, and how plausible representationalism about emotions is going to end up looking will depend on exactly how we flesh it out. But I agree with you, Amy, that we have a foothold here. There's a lot of content available here, and so the situation doesn't seem hopeless, at least for the representationalist.
Right. Okay, and then as we said, with we have these moods that don't where we don't have a foothold, and I think, as we said, we need any kind of representationalist treatment about moods to find the appropriate content, right? And the content also has to, as we've said, it has to account for the phenomenal character. And so maybe we could just start by thinking a little bit about some of the representationalist treatments about moods that have been out there. They're out there in the literature. And then Angela has one too that she can talk about. But some of the things that people have said, and maybe as a preface to this, it's useful to just consider the idea that sometimes people say, well, moods, they're an emotion. The emotion is about the wolf, right? Or the emotion is about the child. But moods, in contrast, they're about everything at once and nothing at all, right? So there's this sort of everything and nothingness to moods. They seem undirected. And I think that everything and nothingness captures something important. So one possibility is to say that moods are about a changing series of objects in the world. So whereas your fear of the wolf is about the wolf, when you're in an anxious mood, you're just sort of anxious about everything that you come across. Or when you're in a fearful mood, everything just seems threatening and scary to you. Or when you're in a happy mood, it's just everything in the world starts seeming rosy. So you walk down the hallway and your colleagues' faces start to seem a little more friendly to you this morning, a little more rosy, and you go outside and the trees are more vivid and the birds chirping. It all just sounds better to you today. And so the point here is that your mood is about these changing series of objects. It's not directed at one thing. So thus it's not directed at one thing in particular. In that respect, it's about nothing, but yet it's directed at a changing series of objects. In that respect, it's about everything. So that's one way that some representationalists have tried to go. And I guess another way that you see, another suggestion that you see in the literature is that what moods represent is not necessarily a changing series of objects, but the mood represents the world as a whole. So when you're in a happy mood, the world, whatever that means, but the world is just a rosy place in contrast to how it seems normally. Or when you're in a fearful mood, the world is a threatening place in contrast to how it seems normally. So it's not sort of first the trees and then the birds and so on, but it's the world as a whole. Okay, so those are a couple of the standard representationalist options. And I guess I think that there are some problems with both of them. Notice, first of all, that they share something in common in that they're both outwardly directed. But I guess that what sort of worries me about those options, or one of the things that worries me about those options, is that it seems that the phenomenology, the phenomenology of the mood can change without the represented contents changing, and vice versa as well. So I don't think the phenomenology and those kinds of represented contents sort of match up very well. So I guess one example that I like to use in this context and that I use in my chapter is if you think about, say, a new father. So he has a newborn, an infant daughter, let's say, and he's sitting in his rocking chair. New parents tend to sit in their rocking chairs for long periods of time with infants on their lap. And so suppose this father is rocking his baby girl for a long time. He's in an elated mood. Okay. Now, if he's sitting there for, say, a couple of hours or a whole morning or a day, over the course of the time that he's sitting there, I think it's natural to suppose that his elated mood waxes and wanes. It gets deeper at some moments, and at some moments it's less deep. And let's suppose that his mood is in some way representing his baby daughter. Well, I think it seems implausible to think that as his mood waxes, as his mood gets deeper, that his daughter starts looking more rosy to him, right? Or as he starts to feel slightly less elated, his daughter starts to seem less rosy to him. That just doesn't seem to me to capture what we want to say. And likewise, I think you can sort of spell out this example for the world as a whole as well. It's not clear to me that we want to say that when my depression is worse, the world seems we always need to say that the world seems blacker to me or more dismal to me. It seems like I might say, the world is just as black as it was yesterday, but it's no more so. But I just feel more depressed today. Those kinds of things seem to me to be coherent, at least, and so I have some worries about how those treatments might work. So that's just a start.
Right. So I am a bit sympathetic to this view, so I think it can account for a lot of cases, but I agree with you, Amy, that there are going to be counterexamples to it. So I think there are going to be cases where it seems implausible to say that how you're representing the world or a series of objects that you encounter doesn't change, but your mood changes independently of all that. So I think there are going to be cases like that. I'd like to mention another problem with this view, at least with some versions of this view. So basically, I think that this view cannot be the whole story. So I agree with you there. Another, at least a question mark about this view is exactly how we're going to unpack the rosiness, the scariness, the joyousness, the sadness that we're representing the world as having, or the changing objects that we encounter as having. So there's a question of what exactly are these properties? Are they physical properties of objects that they actually have? Are they relational properties between us and the objects, or between us and the world as a whole that maybe they sometimes have, or always have, or never have? Are they dispositional properties of the objects to cause, say, physiological reactions in us, to cause us to run away or to approach them, and so on? So I think there's going to be a question here about what these properties end up being, and how plausible the view is going to look for any case will depend on what we say here. So my worry would be that on some ways of unpacking the view, we're going to end up representing properties that seem to be utterly unlike the happiness or joy that the father feels when he's rocking his newborn. Maybe we'll have a view that tells us that he's representing certain physical properties of the newborn, but that doesn't seem right, for example. Mm-hmm. So my personal view here is that this view can only work if we take these properties to be sui generis, to not be analyzable or reducible in terms of physical properties, functional properties, any of the properties that I listed. And only then can we hope to actually capture the phenomenal character of these kinds of states. But then, even then, I think you can only get some of the states. So I think sometimes when you're experiencing a mood, you are representing the world as a great place. You are representing everything that you encounter as being great. Your colleagues are rosier than usual, and so on. But I think there are also cases like the one that you mentioned that escape this kind of view.
Okay. And then I think we should also mention that in addition to being outward directed, one other possibility that a representationalist about moods has is to go inward, right? And so it might be that we try to say, the representationalist tries to say that moods, instead of tracking the world as a whole or tracking a changing series of objects in the world, maybe instead the mood is tracking something about our body, right? So it could be in the way that emotions might track our pulse racing. Well, maybe in moods we don't quite have that, but we have maybe when you're in a particularly happy mood, your body is in some kind of deviation from its baseline state, and that's what the mood is representing or is tracking. Or when you're in an anxious mood, you're in a different kind of deviation from some sort of baseline state, and so that's what the mood is tracking. So there's some options there for the representationalist. I think we would both agree that there are some troubles there too as well. It seems it's hard to really point, in the case of emotions, it's easy many times to point to bodily changes. So think of that moment of fear, your pulse racing, etc. Lots of things to point to. In the case of moods, it's really harder to figure out, even to pinpoint what the bodily changes would be that the representationalist could point to. And so there's a question as to whether the representationalist has enough there to use to capture the phenomenology, which is often very rich.
Right. I agree with these criticisms of this view. Maybe there's room for the representationalists to say that moods are inwardly directed in that they represent features or events or states of yourself, without saying that it's bodily states
Mm-hmm.
that you represent. So maybe there's a sense in which when you feel sad, you represent yourself as down or as sad or something like that. So maybe there's room for a view there, but again, it's going to depend on what exactly we say these contents are, and they're going to have to adequately match the phenomenal character of moods. So in the bodily states view, it doesn't really seem that you can fully capture, say, the fearfulness of a fearful mood by saying that you're representing your heart rate increasing, you're sweating, you have a surge of adrenaline, which is just a hormone, a chemical in your body. That doesn't seem to capture the fearfulness of fear, the urgency and the sense of fear that you have. So if this view is going to be made to work, then I think we have to we need a different kind of inwardly directed content to say that we're representing.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about possible outward views. We've talked a little bit about possible inward views. It's probably worthwhile saying that some philosophers have tried to combine the two and to develop some kind of hybrid view. So it's not just that the mood represents some outward content or some inward content, but it's some sort of combination. I think we won't spend much time on that. I think we agree that there are problems for both of these kinds of views, and putting them together doesn't really seem to solve the problem. So we should say, there are these hybrid views out there. How plausible they are will probably depend on how plausible the views are to some extent separately. Okay, so we sort of surveyed the previously existing options, and that enables us to just sort of focus, or enables me to focus the problem. And I think this is something where we agree that there are some moods that, at least to start, just when we think about them, they do seem to be entirely undirected. So it's hard to even find anything that they could be representing. So probably the easiest example to think about is free-floating anxiety. So when you're in this state of free-floating anxiety, it seems like we can consider such a state that just isn't directed at anything. And that is probably where the sort of thrust of the problem is for the representationalist. And I think we can see how the kinds of accounts that we've been talking about would falter when it comes to these states that just seem to be undirected.
Right. Right. So I agree that there are these states that seem to be entirely undirected, not directed at your body, not directed at the world as a whole, not directed at everything you encounter in your path. These genuinely undirected moods. And I agree that the previous accounts can't account for them, though I do think they might be able to account for some kinds of moods that end up being directed at the world as a whole and so on. But I think the representationalist has something they can say about these genuinely undirected moods. And my suggestion here is that they represent unbound properties. They represent properties without attributing those properties to anything in the world, not to your body, not to the world as a whole, not to particular objects in the world. You just represent the properties. So these properties would be the same kinds of properties that are involved in emotions. The scariness, say, that you attribute to the wolf in an emotion, and the same kinds of properties that would be involved in directed moods, if there are in fact any. So the joyousness you attribute to the world, the sadness you attribute to yourself, maybe if you like the inward view. And I'll just call these properties affective properties without saying a lot more about what they are, at least not now. So for example, when you feel happy, this view would say, when you feel happy, just undirected happiness, you're just representing the happiness. You're feeling only the happiness. You're not representing any particular thing as happy or joyful or good. You're just representing the property that you would use in other states to represent something as as joyous, let's say. All right, so why I like this view? It seems to me that genuinely undirected moods seem to be a lot like emotions, and they seem to be a lot like directed moods, if you think there are any, except the main difference is that they seem to lack an intentional object. They don't qualify any intentional object. So my suggestion, I think, takes this appearance at face value. Genuinely undirected moods are what you get when you take an emotion or a directed mood, and you remove the intentional object. And what you're left with then is a representation of a mere affective property, just the property that isn't qualifying anything. So I said these were genuinely undirected moods, but they are directed insofar as they have contents. So they have to have contents, otherwise it wouldn't be representationalism anymore. But I think we can account for the intuition that they're undirected, in that by saying that they don't have objects. They don't have objects that they qualify in any way. They just have the qualification. So that's a sense in which they are genuinely undirected. And I guess I'll add one more thing, which is that this view can be combined with any view of affective properties. So if you think that that in the case of emotions, emotions represent their intentional objects as having physical properties, then you might want to say that it's those same physical properties that you represent unbound in the case of undirected moods. If you think that you represent properties of your or events or something in your body, then you might take those to be the contents that are represented in moods, and so on. But of course, I think, as I've mentioned briefly before, I think that reductive accounts of the properties represented by directed moods or by emotions would fail to really get the distinctive phenomenal character of those states. And so I think that in this case as well, a reductive account of these affective properties would fail, and so we should take the affective properties to be sui generis, not reducible to anything else.
Okay. Well, I think it's a really interesting suggestion. And I mean, one of the things that Angela's view does very nicely is it captures the sense that that moods have a certain sort of diffuseness to them that emotions don't have, right? And so so she tries to explain this diffuseness by saying that there are these unbound properties. And so I think Angela's view does make progress over the other views in that how to put this exactly, but she's it seems sort of some of the other views seem sort of arbitrary in a certain sense, like they're looking desperately for objects for the mood to represent when there don't seem to be any. And Angela agrees, I think, that we should give up this desperate search for objects and focus instead on the properties. And so it's a nice progress, I think, from the previous views. I guess I do have some questions about it and whether it ultimately works. There's maybe one question we can start with is just, or point that we can start with is just to think a little bit about what it means to say that these properties, and so I'm focusing in on Angela's preferred way of understanding this view, so the properties being sui generis. I think one thing that is worth noting is that these properties aren't going to be involved in our other kinds of attitudes we have. So they're special to the case of emotions and moods. So if we have the thought that the wolf is scary, that's going to be involving a different sort of property from the emotion that we're having that's involving this property of scariness, and likewise from the mood that's involving this property of scariness. So these affective properties for Angela are sui generis. They're different from the kinds of properties that are involved in belief or other sorts of representations. And so I worry a little bit about the possible disconnect here. It seems like insofar as we're representing something, we might think that our beliefs and our emotions and our moods should be representing the same thing. And I think on Angela's view, there's not. So that's maybe that's one question I'll throw out there, Angela, for you to say something about.
Okay, so yeah, so I do think there is this disconnect, but I don't think you have to think that if you like my view. Briefly at the beginning, we said we wouldn't talk about the difference between pure and impure representationalism, but maybe it's relevant here. Okay. So impure representationalism says that not only what matters for phenomenal character is not only what a mental state represents, but certain other of its features, whether it represents it, say, in a certain way, say perceptually, or under a certain mode of presentation, or by a state that plays a certain functional role, or by a state whose content is non-conceptual. And impure representationalism allows you to say that two states can have the same intentional content, but different phenomenal character. So you could have a perceptual experience of blueness and have a certain phenomenal character, but when you think about blue, you don't have the same phenomenal character. And that's because the thought doesn't satisfy certain further conditions that need to be met in order for the state to have phenomenal character in the first place. So there's room to say that these sui generis properties are also represented by thoughts. So why don't you feel emotions? Why don't you feel moods or emotions when you think that a movie is scary without actually watching it and experiencing the fear? Why don't you experience any emotions there? That's because certain other further conditions aren't being met that the impure representationalist says are important for phenomenal character. So there's room to say that, but I want to be a pure intentionalist, a pure representationalist. So I don't want to go that way. So I do accept that there is this disconnect between what the properties that you experience when you feel emotions and moods, and the properties you attribute to objects when you think that those things are scary, or you think about a mood that you were in, or whatever. Well, actually, that's a different case entirely. But the emotion concepts, the emotion and mood concepts that occur in thoughts. So I do think there's a disconnect. I don't think this is a special worry here. Maybe it's a worry, but I don't think it's a special worry in the case of moods and emotions, because I think if you want to be a pure representationalist, you're going to have a similar disconnect in other cases as well. So take the case of color. If you're a pure representationalist, then you have to say that a thought that something is blue and an experience, say a perceptual experience of something blue, have different contents, because otherwise they should have the same phenomenal character. They don't have the same phenomenal characters. They have to have different contents. And if you're not going to invoke other impure elements, then that's all you have to play with to say that the phenomenal character, to account for the difference in phenomenal character. So maybe there's a worry in general. I think there's a story you can tell that makes all this plausible, but I don't think there's a special worry here in the case of moods and emotions.
Okay. So let me ask you a different question too, about your view. And I guess one thing, so I'm trying to think about how exactly to put this point, but we're now talking about the emotion of fear representing something like scariness, right? Or anxiety maybe representing something like threateningness or something like that. And I guess one question is whether all there is to the fear, right, is that the dog, wolf, whatever it is, spider, seems scary, right? So there's definitely something about the scariness of the wolf and so on involved in my experience in the emotion case, and then in the case where we're talking about the mood, right? There's something about scariness there. So sorry, this is a question about both the emotions case and the moods case. But is the fear, or is the fearful mood? It seems like it's not just about scariness. It's about something else too. I don't quite know how to put this, but we're sort of reinterpreting, or we're interpreting fear fully in terms of this scariness, and I wonder if we might think that leaves something out about fear. Sorry, is that coherent enough for you to say something about?
Maybe I'll say something, and then you can tell me if I'm saying something about that.
Okay.
So I take it you're not making the point that there's more to fear than just the representation of scariness and the phenomenal character of scariness. There could be lots of other components of fear right? Like physiological reactions and behavioral dispositions and so on. Maybe even thoughts and desires that go along with fear, or even part of fear. But when you say that there's more to fear than the representation of scariness, I don't think you mean these other components. I think you mean there's more to the phenomenal character of fear. Right. Well, there I think it really depends on what you take scariness to be. If you take scariness to be the wrong thing, then the phenomenal character of fear will seem like it's something over and above whatever you took scariness to be, maybe entirely disconnected from what you take scariness to be. So if you take scariness to be your heart racing, the representation of your heart racing, then the phenomenal character of fear will look like it's something over and above that. If you take scariness to be the disposition of the wolf or other scary things to harm you, then it might still seem that doesn't really capture the phenomenal character of fear. There's more to the fear than just representing that something can harm you. Even if you represent it not in thought, but in a different kind of state, and an emotion kind of state, whatever that ultimately amounts to, you might still think that this content attribution is leaving something out. So that's why I really think that you can't analyze scariness in terms of these other kinds of contents. I think you have to take it at face value. Scariness just is what it appears to be, which is just that phenomenal character that we want to identify with it, and that's what scariness is. So in a way, this gives up on a lot of kind of representationalist projects, in particular the kind of tracking representationalism that we mentioned briefly at the beginning, that aims to reduce consciousness to intentionality, then intentionality to tracking relation. Because basically I'm saying the things that you track, those, I agree with you, those don't capture the scariness of fear, the fearfulness of fear. They don't adequately capture the phenomenal character here. I think there's a lot of things that the tracking representationalists can say in response here. We can get into that, but I guess we both agree that we don't like this view, so we can set it aside. But I do think that if you take these scariness properties to be sui generis and not to be reducible to these other properties that clearly don't seem to match the phenomenal character of fear, then I do think that does adequately capture the phenomenal character of fear. It doesn't leave anything out.
I think I'm sort of understanding your view better the more we talk, and we've been talking a lot. But one thing I'm just thinking now, as I'm maybe getting it more and more for the first time. I mean, for you, the phenomenology. So you're not a reductive representationalist. You want to identify the two, and there's a sense in which, I mean, I want to say there's a sense in which you're sort of not a representationalist, in that for you the two, like the notions of representation and the notion of phenomenology, are really like just intricately bound, right? And so, I mean, I'm almost wondering if we're sort of miscasting you. I mean, maybe in some sense we're both not representationalists. How do you feel about coming out as a non-representationalist? No, you're going to tell me that you are still a representationalist.
I think I'm a limit case of a representationalist.
Maybe that's why I find you so less scary than some of the other representationalists.
Or maybe because I don't instantiate these sui generis properties, but
yeah.
Maybe that too.
Maybe that too.
So I think consciousness is identical to intentionality. I think every phenomenal state is an intentional state. Every intentional state is a phenomenal state. Is consciousness prior to intentionality, or is intentionality prior to consciousness? I think that's a complicated question. There are a lot of issues that come up here, but I'll put my view this way. I think there's one thing, consciousness / intentionality, and it has some of the features we might pre-theoretically attribute to consciousness, and some of the features we might pre-theoretically attribute to intentionality. So, as we think of intentionality pre-theoretically, this one thing, it's in the business of saying something. It presents, it says, here's how the world is, or here's how things are. It presents you with contents. So that's what it does, kind of essentially. But like as we might pre-theoretically think of consciousness, I don't think this saying something is a matter of being related to something. So it's not a matter of tracking something. I don't think it's a matter of being related to abstract entities or propositions or something like that either. So I think it's a non-relational feature of you, which is not a common way of thinking about intentionality, but it is a common way of thinking about consciousness. So I think there's one thing, it has features of both. So is it a theory of consciousness in terms of intentionality, or a theory of intentionality in terms of consciousness? Maybe there's no answer to that question. Maybe you can construe it either way. For the purposes of the paper in this book, I just took it one way rather than the other. But that's the view.
Okay. Well, I mean, maybe this is a good segue. We were going to talk some about some of the standard motivations for representationalism and how they play a role when we start to think about moods. And since we're sort of talking about what representationalism is, it seems like maybe a good time to talk about that. We do that. So one worry that I have when I start to think about moods is I start to think about the standard kinds of one worry I have for the representationalist. I start to think about the standard kinds of arguments for representationalism and what they are, and it seems that the standard arguments for representationalism should apply to moods. If they don't, that seems to be a problem. And so we do discuss this a little bit in our chapters in the book. But it's probably worth talking about it here, because I think we both agree that it plays a sort of big role in the discussion. And so maybe it helps to start with one of the standard arguments for representationalism, which is the argument for transparency. And I guess we could say that the argument goes something like this. This is an argument that's found in Gil Harman's work. It's found in Michael Tye's work. And so Harman says, look at a tree and then start to focus on your experience of the tree. And Harman says when we attend to our experience, when we try to shift from our attention to the tree to our attention to our own experience, our attention just keeps going right out into the world. So we can't attend to any intrinsic properties of our experience. And then this move is made very explicitly by Michael Tye. The idea is that representationalism provides the best explanation of this fact. So we can't attend to any intrinsic properties. Why not? Well, because there aren't any. And representationalism can explain this fact better than other views. Possibly a sense data view, but there are other problems that people have with a sense data view. So the idea is that there's this phenomenon of transparency. Our attention slips right out to the world. We can't focus on our experience itself. Representationalism explains that. And so, I actually have my worries about this argument in the perceptual cases as well, so even when we're talking about the tree. But let's grant for a second, or let me grant for a second, that when you attend to your experience of a tree, your attention slips right out into the world. Well, maybe there's some plausibility in that, that it's really hard to focus on your experience of the tree rather than the tree itself. There's sort of no, it seems like there's no way for you to do that. But now let's switch to a mood, to an experience of a mood, and we say, well, what's supposed to happen? When I attend to my experience of my mood, my experience keeps slipping out, my attention keeps slipping out to what? To the world, to some objects in the world? That doesn't seem right to me, and it actually seems I guess it just seems false to me. It seems to me like when we try to attend to our moods, we don't. We tend to ourselves in some way. We attend to the phenomenology, and we don't attend to the baby or to the tree or to the cloud spaces and so on. And I guess I also think this is one reason that it's important here is that transparency is actually often invoked as a motivation for representationalism. So we have to be representationalists because otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain transparency. And so when there's a failure of transparency in the moods case, well, that worries me. If I'm right that there's a failure of transparency. So so that's one way of sort of talking about representationalism in general and whether the at least one of the standard arguments for representationalism, whether it holds up or falls apart in this case.
Right. So I guess I want to start by agreeing with you that that the argument from transparency, I think, is not very good in the case of moods or in general. I don't think it provides really good reason to be a representationalist, even a representationalist of my sort.
Okay.
The main reason for this is that I don't think it's clear from introspection whether the qualities we experience are qualities of our experience, as the anti-representationalist wants to say, or whether they're just represented qualities, qualities that, if anything has them, it's external objects, or whatever, maybe internal objects, but whatever objects are being represented, objects that are represented. So maybe it helps to focus on an example. So take bluishness again. So there's this bluishness quality in your perceptual experience, and the anti-representationalist says, well, that's a quality of your experience. That's an intrinsic property of your experience. Maybe your experience isn't really blue, it's blue star or something else. But this property this quality that you notice is an intrinsic property of your experience. The representationalist says, no, your experience doesn't have to be blue or blue star, or blue prime or whatever. Rather, what's going on is you're just representing blueness, which is a property that, if anything, has its external objects. So maybe from introspection, it seems that the bluishness attaches to external objects, but I don't think we should put any weight on that at all, because I don't think things would look any different introspectively if the bluishness were a quality of your experience. So I don't think introspection gives us good, clear evidence one way or another as to where the bluishness goes or what kind of thing the bluishness is. Maybe this is a deviation, but in defense of Harman, I think the burden of proof issues are different in his case. He's interested in arguing against someone who says that introspection provides us reason to think that the bluishness is an intrinsic quality of experience. Mm-hmm. So as long as it's unclear from introspection what's going on, then his argument from transparency is good. But Tai wants to argue from inference of the best explanation that representation is the best view we can take here.
Right.
And insofar as this is a good argument, I think it's going to have to depend on a lot more than introspection. So I think it does. I think there's some stuff about how projectivism is a bad view and all that. I mean, it goes pretty quickly, but it's going to have to rely a lot more heavily on these theoretical considerations and less on introspection of the bluishness. So that is a really long-winded point about why I really don't like the argument from transparency, and I don't think representationalists should rely on it. And I do think there are better arguments, even arguments that rely on introspection for representationalism, and I do think that they can support representationalism about moods, at least indirectly, and maybe we can say something about that later. But maybe I'll say something to try to defend the representationalists a little bit here, after I said this argument is totally worthless. So the claim is, so Amy, your claim is that when you attend to the qualities of your moods, they don't appear to be qualities of external objects. Instead, they appear to be qualities of your experience. So there's a negative and a positive claim that the friend of transparency wants to make. The negative claim is that the qualities that you notice don't appear to be intrinsic qualities of experience. And the positive claim is that they appear to be properties of represented external objects. And so you're claiming that both the positive and the negative transparency claim here. So I agree with you that the positive transparency claims fails. I agree with you that the qualities involved in moods don't seem to be qualities involved in qualities of external objects that are represented. So when you pay attention to the qualities of your moods, your attention doesn't go to some represented external objects. Like you said, I agree with that, but I think that that's compatible with representationalism, at least is compatible with my version of representationalism, on which moods represent unbound properties, because that would predict that your attention wouldn't go out to represented external objects, because that's not where the moods are. Sorry, that's not where the mood qualities are.
Right.
That's not where they're represented as being, so your attention shouldn't go there. So I don't think that's a problem. Maybe it's a problem for other representationalist treatments of moods that might predict that your attention should go to represented external objects when you attend to the qualities of moods. So if anything, I think this would support my treatment of at least some moods over the alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to negative transparency, I guess this is just the point that I just made earlier. I think it's unclear whether the qualities of experience are intrinsic qualities of your experience or represented properties of represented external objects. I think it's unclear based on introspection which of these possibilities is correct. So in the case of mood qualities, is the scariness bit, is that a quality of my experience, an intrinsic property of my experience? Is it my experience that is scary, or scary star, or scary prime, or something like that? Or is it a represented property of a represented object, or in the case of unbound properties, just a represented property? And I don't think that introspection can really tell these cases apart. So it's not clear that there's a failure of negative transparency, or at least it's not clear there's a problematic failure here. So I just don't know what we can say here.
Okay. So you were talking just then in terms of scariness, right? And that's already to switch to sort of like the representational terms. Or so I think I should probably stick to trying to make the point in terms of like the fearfulness or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. I'm not sure that it's ultimately going to settle the question between us, but I would probably want to insist that we sort of focus on the try to focus on the phenomenological descriptors insofar as they're different. But sorry, you said that you have that there's another argument that you think works better than the transparency argument, so maybe we should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, just to point what you just said, by scariness, I meant to be picking out the phenomenal character.
Neutral, yeah.
Yeah, I meant to be picking it out neutrally. So,
okay.
But I think everything still holds if you call it fearfulness, fearishness,
right.
Whatever.
Felt fear, yeah. Okay. It's just scariness seems to, well, okay.
Yeah, it seems to suggest a representationalist treatment, so maybe it's unfair to.
Yeah.
So the nearby argument for representationalism that is also based on introspective considerations. So I think that the best reason to be a representationalist about various phenomenal characters and to say they're nothing over and above represented contents is that these phenomenal characters basically just behave like they're nothing over and above represented contents. So take the phenomenal character of bluishness. So I think from introspection we can tell that when we have the phenomenal character of bluishness, you don't just have this bluishness phenomenal character kind of free-floating in your mind. The phenomenal character seems to attach to and qualify a represented object, in this case this object, this book, which is represented in some, either as a shape or as an object or as a book in your mind. The bluishness seems to attach to and qualify this book. And what I mean by it qualifies the represented book, it basically says that it's blue. So it contributes some content to a larger contentful state that says that the book is blue. And that is representation-like behavior. That's how contents behave. So based on this behavior, which we can notice from introspection of bluishness, I think we can conclude that bluishness is a represented content, and mental states with the bluishness quality are in the business of representing, of saying something. And I think this applies also to emotions. So take the fearishness or fearfulness, whatever you want to call it, of a fear of a dog. That fearishness attaches to the dog and qualifies the dog. It contributes to an overall representational state that says that the dog is a certain way. threatening or scary, or if you prefer fear-ish, whatever it is however it is that you want to describe your overall representational states. The dog seems different in having the fearful experience, and it's the fearishness that's attaching to the dog that contributes to this difference. So again, like in the case of bluishness, which attaches to and qualifies represented objects, fearishness also attaches to and qualifies represented objects, and that's content-like behavior, and so I think that that's reason to take this fearishness to just be identical to a content, just be a content. So it might seem that this doesn't apply to moods, because when we have at least in the case of undirected moods, when we have a mood, there's this mood quality, but that doesn't seem to attach to and qualify any represented objects, and I agree with that, right? So what do we say about moods? Well, so I think the argument can be extended as follows to apply to moods as well. So as we noted a couple of times during this discussion, moods are phenomenally similar to emotions. Mm-hmm. And undirected moods are phenomenally similar to emotions as well. So it's plausible that moods and emotions involve the very same phenomenal characters. And in the context of emotions, these phenomenal characters behave like represented contents. They attach to and qualify represented objects. So the fearishness attaches to and qualifies the dog in the context of an emotion. But in a mood, it doesn't exemplify this content-like behavior. Still, it's the same phenomenal character. And so it's very plausible that whether it's in the context of an emotion or in the context of a mood, it is a represented content. So represented contents don't have to exhibit their content-like nature in all contexts. It's enough if they exhibit it often enough, or perhaps even sometimes, in order for us to conclude that it's a content that we're dealing with here. So I think that's a reason to be a representationalist about moods. I think it supports any kind of representationalism about moods, but I think it works best with my kind of representationalism about moods.
Right. Yeah, I think. I think it's a really interesting argument, and I think it's definitely more plausible than the argument from transparency, which we both don't like, or at least we don't think it's going to be an argument for the standard sorts of representationalist views. And then I guess. It's definitely something that I need to think more about. There still seems something different to me about the bluishness from these other kinds of properties that are going on in emotions and moods. And I guess, we had put on hold sort of the question about, or we had said we weren't going to worry too much about whether moods are a subclass of emotions or not. And I think that this argument might depend more on a tighter connection between emotions and moods. Well, let me put it this way. Certainly this argument presupposes a tight connection between emotions and moods. And so I don't know that we would have to settle the question that we put aside earlier, but nonetheless, it's important to note that the more we see moods and emotions as distinct, the less this argument is going to work, because it's going to extend to moods on the basis of their similarity with emotions. So I think the argument, whether it can be extended to moods in that way, is going to depend somewhat on this question about the continuum between emotions and moods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Let me just say a quick point, which is I agree with that. The kind of connection that you really need is a phenomenal similarity. So It doesn't really matter if your heart races when you're in a fearful emotion but not in a fearful mood, or if there are other differences, if an emotion but not a mood is accompanied by various kinds of thoughts or whatever. All that matters is that there's this phenomenal similarity, that the phenomenal characters that we're talking about are the same ones.
Right. No, yeah. Right. Of course, it's still going to be okay. If emotions only can last no more than 5 minutes, and moods can last longer, right? I didn't mean to be talking about those kinds of differences. We just would have to sort of attend more closely to the phenomenal similarity. And sometimes I I think that there's a lot of phenomenal similarity. And then sometimes when I think about being in a happy mood over the course of a few days, it feels somewhat different, I think, from that, moment of happiness. And so we'd have to sort of explore more the phenomenal similarity there. There's something that's the same about them. There's something that's different about them. And so, sorry, and when I say that, I mean phenomenally. There's something phenomenally similar about them. There's something phenomenally different about them. And so I think there would be more exploration to do there. So were there other things that we wanted to cover? We've talked through, I think, a good amount of the material about the representational treatment of moods, and I think it was a great conversation. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks, I enjoyed it too.
So we should probably thank the folks at Philosophy TV for hosting us, and we should also thank Uriah Kriegel for putting together this great book and giving us the opportunity to debate on the pages, and also the opportunity to debate on air. And I'm sure we'll be talking further and trying to figure these things out. Okay.
Yes, great.
Okay.
I second all
that.
It's been
fun talking to you.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.